Jam, jam to stuff. Welcome back, everyone, to another chapter of Mere Christianity. And, of course, if you're paying attention, you may know and see that this is actually the second to last chapter we'll be covering ever, in this book at least. Like I said, this is going to be the second to last one, so next week's will be the last chapter of Mere Christianity we'll be reading, and then the book will be over, and I'll have to figure out something else to do. But in the meantime, hey, at least we'll be glad that I finished reading one of the best, most important Christian books, outside of like the Bible, of course, ever. Also, of course, it's C.S. Lewis. His way with words and like actual arguments are extremely good, important, wise, etc. Anyways, that being neither here nor there, let me play the music. There we go. And B, let's talk about what happened last time. The last time we covered this chapter here, chapter 9, counting the cost. And to give a basic, brief, overarching summary of this chapter, it was fairly short. I would say go watch the episode or listen to it, whatever you want to do with it. But also say go read the book. I think I have the link in the description below, or you can just Google, read Mere Christianity, whatever, because that's what I'm doing. It's free and open. But to go over it, counting the cost, it's basically how when we were asking God, when we're on our knees before Him saying, God, let your will be done. Let your will be done in my life. However you have planned, because I know you're God. You know better than I. So let your will be done in my life. Let me follow your plan, etc. When we're asking God that, it's actually a bigger, huge ask than when we're initially thinking, especially in terms of the cost. Because when we're asking God for help, we're basically asking ourselves and Him to do everything in His power for Him. So we're also supposed to make like a sacrifice for it. And so asking God's will to be done in our lives is basically asking, to stop our life, to stop our current life version of ourselves, and to, turn it over to God and everything. The best analogy I can give would be basically like if we're asking, a professional trainer, so to speak, to give us advice or make a meal plan, training plan for us, okay, and to go all out. Or I'm your blank canvas, right? Do what you will, trainer, right? And then he gives us this very, very, very intimate, in detail, very high cost, debilitatingly, in a painful way, type of training regimen where it's you're allowed to eat this much food and you have to burn this much calories and work out for this long and this long and this part of the day for this long. It'd be like asking that person for help. They give us that type of plan, and then we're surprised, or not surprised maybe, about that plan that they give us, that idea, because we're like, oh, I thought you were just, telling me how work out an extra day of the week or for an extra hour, or don't eat this much food, etc. But instead, we're getting this extremely high cost, exceptionally life consuming, all around plan. And so, and a lot of times, it's just more than we're thinking, right? We're kind of biting off more than we can chew when we ask for God's will to be done or for His assistance in these things. But it's also good because, we're kind of turning it over to God. We're kind of saying, God, or, I hate to say this, but, Jesus, take the wheel. Anyways, that was that chapter, right? So, that was that chapter. That was last week's problem. Now we're on to this week's problem. And this one is a bit of a long one. Called Chapter 10, Nice People or New Men. Let me get a drink of water. He meant what he said. Those who put themselves in His hand will become perfect, as He is perfect. Perfect in love, wisdom, joy, beauty, and immortality. The change will not be complete in His life or death. In this life or death, it is an important part of the treatment. How far the change will have gone before death in any particular Christian is uncertain. I think this is the right moment to consider a question which is often asked. If Christianity is true, why are not all Christians obviously nicer than all non-Christians? What lies behind that question is partly something very reasonable and partially something that is not reasonable at all. The reasonable part is this. If conversion to Christianity makes no improvement in a man's outward actions, if he continues to be just as snobbish or spiteful or envious or ambitious as he was before, then I think we must suspect that this conversion was largely imaginary and after one's original conversion. Every time one thinks one has made an advance, that is the test to apply. Fine feelings, new insights, greater interests in religion mean nothing unless they make our actual behavior better. Just as in illness, feeling better is not much good if the thermometer shows that your temperature is still going up. I forgot what that word and thing was for a second. In that sense, the outer world is quite right to judge Christianity by its results. Christ told us to judge by results. a tree is known by its fruit, or as we say, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. I think he just means to say the proof is in the pudding. When we Christians behave badly or fail to behave well, we are making Christianity unbelievable to the outside world. The wartime posters told us that careless talk costs lives. It is equally true that careless lives cost talk. Our careless lives set the outer world talking, and we give them grounds for talking in a way that throws doubt on the truth of Christianity itself. But there is another way of demanding results in which the outer world may not be quite illogical. They may demand not merely that each man's life should improve if he becomes a Christian, they may also demand that they believe in Christ, or they believe in Christianity, that they should see the whole world neatly divided into two camps, Christian and non-Christian, and that all the people in the first camp at any given moment should be obviously nicer than all the people in the second. This is unreasonable on several grounds. 1. In the first place, the situation in the actual world is much more complicated than that. The world does not consist of 100% Christians and 100% non-Christians. There are people, a great many of them, who are slowly ceasing to be Christians who still call themselves by that name. Some of them are clergymen. There are other people who are slowly becoming Christians, though they do not know if they do not call themselves so. They don't know it yet. There are people who do not accept the full Christian doctrine about Christ, but who are so strongly attracted by him that they are his in a much deeper sense. That's interesting. Than they themselves understand. There are people in other religions who are being led by God's secret influence to concentrate on those parts of their religion which are in agreement with Christianity, and who thus belong to Christ knowing it. Who belong to Christ without knowing it. For example, a Buddhist of good will be led to concentrate more and more on the Buddhist teaching about mercy and to live in the background. Though he still might be believed, the Buddhist teaching on certain other points, many of the good pagans, long before Christ's birth, may have been in this position. And anyways, of course, there are a great many people who are just confused in mind and have a lot of inconsistent beliefs, all jumbled up together. Consequently, it is not much use trying to make judgments about Christians and non-Christians in the mass. It is some use comparing cats and dogs, or even men and women, in the mass because there one knows definitely which is which. Also, an animal does not turn, either slowly or suddenly, from a dog into a cat. But when we are comparing Christians in general with non-Christians in general, we are usually not thinking about real people who we know at all, but only about two vague ideas which we have gotten from novels and newspapers. If you want to compare the bad Christians and the good atheists, you must think about two real specimens, whom you have actually met. Unless we come down to brass tacks in that way, we shall only be wasting time. And now to his second point. Suppose we have come down to brass tacks and are not talking about an imaginary Christian and an imaginary non-Christian, but about two real people in our own neighborhood. Even then we must be careful to ask the right questions. If Christianity is true, then it ought to follow A, that any Christian will be nicer than the same person would be if he were not a Christian. B, that any man who becomes a Christian will be nicer than he was before. Just in the same way if the advertisements of White Smiles toothpaste are true, it ought to follow A, that anyone who uses it will have better teeth than the same person would have if he did not use it. And B, that if anyone begins to use it, his teeth will improve, but to the point that I, who use White Smiles and also have inherited bad teeth from both my parents, have not got as fine a set as some healthy young dick spine as by itself not. Okay. That he goes, this is a long analogy just to talk about teeth, bro. Or toothpaste. Christian Miss Bates may have an unkinder tongue than unbelieving Dick Firkin? That by itself does not tell us whether Christianity works. The question is what Miss Bates' tongue would be like if she were not a Christian, and what Dick's would be like if he became one. Miss Bates and Dick, as a result of natural causes and early upbringing, have certain temperaments. Christianity professes to put both temperaments under a new management, if they will allow it to do so. What you have a right to ask is whether that management, if allowed to take over, improves the concern. Everyone knows that what is being managed. In Dick Firkin's case, it is much nicer than what is being managed. In Miss Bates, that is not the point. To judge the management of a factory, you must consider not only the output, but the plant. Considering the plant at factory, or the plant at factory A, would be a wonder. It may be a wonder that it turns out anything at all, considering the first-class outfit at factory B, its output, though high, may be a great deal lower than it ought to be. No doubt, the good manager at factory A is going to put in new machinery as soon as they can, but that takes time. In the meantime, low output does not prove that he is a failure. Let me get a drink of water. Whew, nice and cold. And 3, and now let us go a little deeper. The manager is going to put in a new machinery before Christ has finished with Miss Bates. She's going to be very nice indeed, but if we left it all at that, it would sound as though Christ's only aim was to pull Miss Bates up to the same level at which Dick had been all along. We've been talking, in fact, as if Dick were all right, as if Christianity was something nasty people needed and nice people could afford to do without, as if niceness was all that God demanded. But this would be a fatal mistake. The truth is that in God's eyes, Dick Firkin needs saving every bit as much as Miss Bates. In one sense, I will explain what sense in a moment. Niceness hardly comes into the question. You cannot expect a God to look at Dick's placid temper and friendly disposition exactly as we do. They result from natural causes which God himself creates. Being merely temperamental, they will all disappear if Dick's digestion alters. The niceness, in fact, in God's gift to Dick, not Dick's gift to God. In the same way, God has allowed natural causes, working in a very spoiled by centuries of sin, to produce in Miss Bates the narrow mind and jangled nerves which account for most of her nastiness. Why is my music stopped? There we go. Okay. Her nastiness. He intends in his own good time to set that part of her right, but that is not, for God, the critical part of the business. It presents no difficulties. It is not what he is anxious about. What he is watching and waiting and working for is something that is not easy, even for God, because from the nature of the case, even he cannot produce it by a mere act of power. He is waiting and watching for it both in Miss Bates and in Dick Firkin. You couldn't have chose a different person, man. It is something that they can freely give him or freely refuse to him. Will they or won't they turn to him and thus fulfill the only purpose for which they were created? Their free will is trembling inside them like the needle of a compass, but this is a needle that can choose. It can point to its true north, but it need not. Will the needle swing around and settle and point to God? He can help it to do so. He cannot force it. He cannot, so to speak, put on his own hand and pull it into the right position, for then it would not be free will anymore. Will it point north? That is the question on which it all hangs. Will Miss Bates and Dick offer their nature to God? The question whether the natures they offer or withhold are, at that moment, nice or nasty ones, is of secondary importance. God can see that part of the problem. Do not misunderstand me, of course. God regards a nasty nature as a bad and deplorable thing. And of course, he regards a nice nature as a good thing. Good like bread or sunshine or water. But these are the good things which he gives and we receive. He created Dick's sound nerves and good digestion, and there's plenty more where they come from. It costs God nothing, so far as we know, to create nice things. But to convert rebellious wills costs his crucifixion, and because they are wills, they can, and nice people, just as much as nasty ones, refuse his request, and then they can refuse his request. The spacing and writing of this is so weird. And then, because that niceness in Dick was merely part of nature, it will go all to pieces in the end. Nature herself will all pass away. Natural causes come together in Dick to make a pleasant psychological pattern, just as they come together in a sunset to make a pleasant pattern of colors. Presently, for that is now how nature works, it will fall apart again, and the pattern in both cases will disappear. Dick has had the chance to turn, or rather to allow God to turn, that momentary pattern into the beauty of eternal spirit, and he has not taken it. There's a paradox here. As long as Dick does not turn to God, he thinks his niceness is his own. Just as long as he thinks that, it is not his own. It is when Dick realizes that his niceness is not his own, but a gift from God, and when he offers it back to God, it is just then that it begins to be really his own. For now, Dick is beginning to take a share of his own creation. The only thing we can keep are the things we freely give to God. What we are trying to keep for ourselves is just what we are sure to lose. We must, therefore, not be surprised if we find among the Christians some people who are still nasty. There is even, when you come to think of it over, a reason why nasty people might be expected to turn to Christ in greater numbers than the nice ones. That was what people objected to about Christ during his life on earth. He seemed to attract such awful people. That is what people still object to and always will. Do you not see why? Christ said, "Blessed are the poor," and how hard is it for rich to enter the kingdom? And no doubt, he primarily meant the economically rich and economically poor. But do not his words also apply to another kind of riches and poverty? One of the dangers of having a lot of money is that you may be quite satisfied with the kinds of happiness money can give and so fail to realize your need for God. If everything seems to come simply by signing checks, you may forget that you are at every moment totally dependent on God. Now, quite plainly, natural gifts carry with them a similar danger. If you have sound nerves and intelligence and health and popularity and a good upbringing, you are likely to be quite satisfied with your character as it is. Why drag God into it, you may ask? A certain level of good conduct comes fairly easily to you. You are not one of those wretched creatures who are always being tripped up by sex or dipsomania. Dipsomania, I'd never heard that word. Or nervousness or bad temper. Everyone says you are a nice chap, and between yourselves, you agree with them. You are quite likely to believe that all this niceness is your own doing, and you may easily not feel the need for any kind of goodness. Often people who have all these natural kinds of goodness cannot be brought to recognize their need for Christ at all, until one day the natural goodness lets them down and their self-satisfaction is shattered. In other words, it is hard for those who are rich in this sense to enter the kingdom. Let me get more water. It is very different from the nasty people, the little, low, timid, warped, thin-blooded, lonely people, or the passionate, sensual, unbalanced people. If they make any attempt at goodness at all, they learn in double, quick time that they need help. It is Christ or nothing for them. It is taking up the cross and following, or else despair. They are the lost sheep. He came specially to find them. They are, in one very real and terrible sense, the poor. He blessed them. They are the awful set. He goes about with, and of course the Pharisees say still, as they said from the first, if they were anything in Christianity, those people would not be Christians. One moment. Why does my music keep stopping? Oh, there we go. That's weird. It keeps stopping. They are the awful set he goes about with, and of course the Pharisees say still, as they said from the first, if they were anything in Christianity, those people would not be Christians. There's either a warning or an encouragement here for every one of us. If you are a nice person, if virtue comes easily to you, beware. Much is expected from those to whom much is given. If you mistake for your own merits what are really God's gifts to you through nature, and if you are content with simply being nice, you are still a rebel, and all those gifts will only make your fall more terrible, your corruption more complicated, and your bad example more disastrous. The devil was an archangel one. His natural gifts were as far above yours and yours as above those of a chimpanzee. Above yours? Far above yours as yours are above a chimpanzee. I read that wrong. But if you are a poor creature, poisoned by a wretched upbringing in some house full of vulgar jealousies and senseless quarrels, saddled by no choice of your own with some loathsome sexual perversion, nagged day in and day out by an inferiority complex that makes you snap at your best friends, do not despair. He knows all about it. You are the one poor whom he blessed. He knows what a wretched machine you are trying to drive. Keep on. Do what you can. One day, perhaps in another world, but perhaps far sooner than that, he will fling it on the scrap heap and give you a new one. And then you will astonish us all, not least yourself, for you have learned your driving in a hard school. Some of the last will be first, and some of the first will be last. Niceness, wholesomeness, integrated personality is an excellent thing. We must try by every medical, educational, economic, and political means in our power to produce a world where as many people as possible grow up nice. Just as we must try to produce a world where all have plenty to eat. But we must not suppose that even if we succeed in making everyone nice, we should have saved their souls. A world of nice people, content in their own niceness, looking no further, turned away from God, would be just as desperately in need of salvation as a miserable world, and might even be more difficult to save. For more improvement is not redemption, although redemption always improves people, even here and now, and will, in the end, improve them to a degree we cannot yet imagine. God became man to turn creatures into sons, not simply to produce better men of the old kind, but produce a new kind of man. It is not like teaching a horse to jump better and better, but like turning a horse into a winged creature. Into a Pegasus. Of course, once it has got its wings, it will soar over fences which could have never been jumped, which could never have been jumped, and thus beat the natural horse at its own game. But there may be a period while the wings are just beginning to grow when it cannot do so, and at that stage, the lumps on the shoulders, Noah could tell by looking at them that they are going to be wings, may even give it an awkward appearance. The reading in this one feels very out there. Thank God we're almost done. But perhaps we have already spent too long on this question. If what you want is an argument against Christianity, and I will remember how eagerly I looked for such arguments when I began to be afraid it was true, you can easily find some stupid and unsatisfactory Christian and say, so there's your boasted new man, give me the old kind. But But if once you have begun to see that Christianity is on the other grounds profitable, you will know in your heart that this is only evading the issue. What can you even really know of other people's souls, of their temptations, their opportunities, their struggles? One soul in the whole creation you do know, and it is only one whose fate is placed in your hands. If there is a God, you are, in a sense, alone with him. You cannot put him off with speculations about your next door neighbor or memories of what you have read in books. What will all that chatter and heresy count? Will you even be able to remember it? When the anesthetic fog, which we call nature or the real world, fades away, and the presence in which you have always stood becomes palpable, immediate, and unavoidable. I like how it ended there. Okay. That was the end of the chapter. Wow. Only one chapter left, guys. I'm actually, very much so sad and a little disappointed to see that we're almost done with the book. But, it's a good book, so that's good. Let's see. How long did that take, actually? That was quite a while. 20 minutes just for that. Awesome. Maybe it wasn't that long. It just felt long. Okay, like I said, to go over it now. That was very complicated to read and difficult. I do think that certain parts he kind of worded on and, just added way too much description and words than he needed to. It was very unnecessary, I felt, in some parts. But I think I kind of understand what he's saying here, and it's against this idea of kind of, hypocrisy of, okay, if being Christian was so good, why are so many Christians, bad apples? Why are there so many bad Christians that I can know of? And I do kind of like a lot of his arguments here, where he's kind of, to some degree, saying that we will know them by their fruits. And that is just straight up a lot of parts here. He just mentioned scripture, or was mentioned in scripture, like saying, you will know them by their fruits, right? So if a bad Christian is not producing fruit at all, right? Bad fruit, whatever you want to call it, then you can kind of tell and know, oh, it's not a Christian. This is an apple tree. This is a pear tree, right? Whatever it would be. I don't know. I don't know of fruit trees very much. But you get the analogy. Then it would be like, yeah, well, they're not. And it's also, he kind of doesn't really say this, but I would make this claim, right? Of just because someone claims this one thing, right, doesn't mean they are that thing. I think nowadays it's most important where it's like, just because someone claims to, identify as like, a man or a woman, etc., an Apache attack helicopter, it doesn't mean they are that thing. There's a reality to the world, and words and all that are what we use to describe that reality. And so if someone's saying all these things, if someone says they're Christian, right, if they have a card, right, if it says registered Christian, registered Democrat, Republican, etc., right, but then their actions, thoughts, everything they do says the opposite of that, right? If they say they're Christian, they have a logo that says they're Christian, but they don't do that, they don't go to church, they don't read the Bible, they don't, help their neighbor, they don't, do etc. Name some other Christian things, feed the homeless, feed the hungry, etc. They don't do Christian things. They're not producing fruit, good fruit, and they're not trying to help and spread the good word or mention it for the glory of God. Then they're not. It's very simple in that regard. And this is the kind of point that I have a hard time. Because people have a hard time understanding it, or I should say accepting it, because they will often somewhat agree that, oh yeah, just because someone says one thing when they do the other doesn't mean they are that thing. But then as soon as it comes to them actually having to apply and admit, oh yeah, those people in your life that you knew weren't really Christian per se, they have a hard time, say, admitting that. I think that's, a personal thing where I think just people have a hard time accepting facts to some degree. That was one part of it. This was really long. It kind of went on in many different points, but I do understand what he's saying as well. And I kind of pulled it to it here, where he's basically saying that, some people have different temperaments. Some people are just naturally nicer. Some people are naturally chiller, calmer, or angrier, etc. And in a lot of ways, that's all by design, and it's all thanks to God in that way, right? Like he says here, this person, Dick Richards, if you would. If he has this nice, very chill, melancholic attitude, in a lot of ways, it's only because of God, because in God's plan or whatever happened, he had a good upbringing, etc., that was able to produce this good melancholic attitude in him. But also makes it all the more problematic in the end of his life, because if you're just like this because you have everything handed to you, then that probably means it's not real or genuine. And at least to me, that kind of hit hard to home, because as someone who was born in like, modern day, year 2000, whatever it may have been, and has more or less never struggled like my ancestors would, right? Where like just 2,000 years ago, people were going to war, dying at the age of like 30, etc., to disease, war, bandits, thievery, etc. Right now in modern day, This is the most privileged time to be alive. We never had to fight or, what's the word? We never had to fight or struggle like people did before us. And that's a real thing I understand, and I do worry about that just in myself. I ask God for help in regards to that. That it's not just because, oh, I live in a nice house with good parents, good siblings, etc. Or good enough, right? I never have to go worry about starving, about, being warm, food, bed, etc. I never have to worry about those things. And I do wonder that if those were taken away from me, would I still be a follower of Christ? Would I still worship God? I like to think that I would, but, we don't know until it actually happens. And as he says as well, the proof is in the pudding, so to speak. We won't know unless that does happen. And so I do like that point that he mentions here. It's very important, and that part hits extremely close to home with me. And that does make sense. But that was my basic reading of it. Like I said, I enjoy this. I'm also still a little sick, if you can hear that. My throat is a little dry. That's why I had to keep drinking water. So that's the end of that chapter. Next week, I'll see you again for the last chapter of Mere Christianity. Thank you for showing up.